Windows 8. In May 2014, China did something that made headlines around the world, but was widely misunderstood. The Chinese government banned Windows 8 from all government procurement, not from the country. Not from stores, not from your laptop, from government computers. This was a state procurement ban, which means that any government agency purchasing new computers was not allowed to buy machines with Windows 8 pre-installed. If you were a regular person living in China, you could walk into a store, buy a Windows 8 laptop, go home, and use it without any issue whatsoever. The operating system was not illegal, it was just unwelcome in government offices. The reason China gave was security and trust concerns.
Meanwhile, China has announced that it will ban the use of the Windows 8 operating system in new government computers, and the move is set to ensure computer security after Microsoft stopped offering security updates and support for its previous operating system, Windows XP.
At the time, Microsoft had just ended support for Windows XP, an operating system that was still deeply embedded in Chinese infrastructure. The sudden push to Windows 8, which introduced a radically different interface and deep cloud integration, made Chinese officials nervous. They didn't trust where the data was going. They didn't trust the update mechanism. And after the Edward Snowden revelations in 2013, which exposed mass surveillance programs run by the United States government, China was not in the mood to hand over control of its government systems to a company based in Redmond, Washington. So China didn't ban Windows 8 for citizens. It banned it from official government use, which is a very different thing and a much bigger deal. Because when a government stops buying your product, it sends a message to every state-owned enterprise and every institution that relies on government contracts. It's a quiet form of pressure that doesn't require laws or arrests, just purchasing decisions. Windows blocked in Iranian government offices. In 2013, Iran announced that Windows would be banned from government offices, not from the entire country, not from people's homes, from the desks, servers, and workstations used by state institutions. This decision came during a period of escalating tension between Iran and the West. International sanctions were tightening. Iranian infrastructure had been targeted by cyber attacks, most notably Stuxnet, a sophisticated worm that damaged nuclear centrifuges and was widely believed to be a joint operation by the United States and Israel. The Iranian government was acutely aware that relying on American software for sensitive operations was a vulnerability they could not afford, so they pushed for Linux-based alternatives. Iran had already been developing its own national operating system, and this ban was part of a broader strategy to reduce dependence on foreign technology. The government wanted control. They wanted transparency. They wanted to know exactly what was running on their machines and where the data was going. But here's the key detail. This wasn't about people's home computers. It was about what the government itself was allowed to run. If you were an Iranian citizen, you could still buy Windows, install it, use it, and update it. The ban applied only to state institutions, which is a very specific and very deliberate form of restriction. It's also worth noting that enforcement of this kind of policy is complicated. Government offices don't switch operating systems overnight. Many departments continued using Windows for years after the announcement, either because migration was too expensive or because the alternatives were not ready. But the intent was clear. Iran wanted to control its own digital infrastructure, and Windows was in the way. Windows downloads blocked in Russia. In 2022, after Russia invaded Ukraine, a wave of sanctions hit Russian entities, and Western companies began pulling out of the Russian market. Microsoft was one of them. But what actually happened to Windows in Russia was more subtle than a ban. Microsoft stopped allowing users in Russia to download Windows installation files from its official servers. If you were in Russia and wanted to download a fresh copy of Windows 10 or Windows 11, the download page would not work. Tools like the Media Creation tool, which let you create bootable installation drives, were also blocked. Official updates became inconsistent. Some users reported that activation servers were unreachable. But here's what didn't happen. Windows didn't stop working. If you already had Windows installed, your computer continued to function. Existing installations kept running. Some updates still came through, depending on your region and configuration. And there was no Russian law that made using Windows illegal. This was a distribution block, not a legal ban. Microsoft, as a private company, restricted access to its servers for users in a specific geographic region. It was a vendor-level decision, not a government decree. Windows wasn't outlawed. Access to official downloads and tools was blocked by the vendor. The result was predictable. Piracy surged. Gray market keys became the norm. People turned to unofficial sources for installation media, which introduced new security risks. And while the Russian government made noise about promoting domestic alternatives, the reality on the ground was that Windows remained dominant, just harder to obtain legally. macOS X. In 2008, a company called SciStar started selling desktop computers that ran Mac OS X. That might not not sound revolutionary, but it was illegal, and it triggered one of the most important legal battles in operating system history. Apple has always had one very clear rule. macOS X, now called macOS, can only be installed on Apple hardware. This is written into the license agreement. It's not a suggestion. It's a legally binding restriction that every user agrees to when they install the operating system. Apple's entire business model depends on this. They don't just sell software, they sell the integration of hardware and software, and breaking that integration breaks the deal. SiStar didn't care. They bought retail copies of macOS X, installed them on generic Intel-based PCs, and sold those machines for a fraction of the price of a real Mac. They called them open computers, and they marketed them as a cheaper alternative to Apple's expensive hardware. For a brief moment, it looked like they might get away with it. They didn't. Apple sued, and the case went to court. In 2009, a federal judge ruled in Apple's favor and issued a permanent injunction. SiStar was banned from selling computers with Mac OS X installed. The operating system wasn't banned. The way it was being sold was. This is an important distinction. The court didn't say Mac OS X was illegal. It said that violating Apple's license agreement by installing the operating system on unauthorized hardware and selling it commercially was illegal. If you wanted to build a Hackintosh at home for personal use, that existed in a legal gray area. You were still violating the license agreement, but Apple wasn't going to sue individual hobbyists. What they would not tolerate was someone turning that violation into a business. SiStar tried to appeal. They argued that Apple's license was anti-competitive and that users should have the right to install Mac OS X on any hardware they wanted. The Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals disagreed. In 2011, the ruling was upheld. SiStar went bankrupt, and the precedent was set. Mac OS X could only legally run on Apple hardware. Hackintoshes still exist. Enthusiast communities still build them, but they do so knowing that they are violating the terms of service, and that if Apple ever decided to crack down harder, they would have no legal ground to stand on. Redstar OS. Redstar OS is one of the strangest operating systems ever created, and it's not banned worldwide. It's just never allowed to leave the system it was built to control. North Korea developed Redstar OS as a state-controlled alternative to Western operating systems. It's based on Linux, but modified heavily to serve the needs of a totalitarian regime. The interface mimics older versions of Mac OS X, which is oddly ironic given that North Korea has no official relationship with Apple, but the resemblance is deliberate. The goal was to make it familiar enough that users wouldn't resist it, while maintaining total control over what those users could do. Redstar OS includes features that would be unthinkable in any other operating system. It watermarks every file that passes through the system. If you open a document, an image, or a video, the operating system silently embeds metadata that ties that file to your specific machine. If that file ever leaves your computer and ends up somewhere it shouldn't be, the government can trace it back to you. It also monitors your activity. The operating system includes built-in surveillance tools that track which files you access, which programs you run, and even attempts to detect unauthorized modifications. Most of what we know about Redstar OS comes from leaked copies and analysis by security researchers, not from official public documentation. If you try to disable core system functions or tamper with the operating system itself, Redstar OS will notice, and depending on the version, it may log that activity or shut down entirely. And it doesn't connect to the global internet. North Korea operates a closed intranet called Kwangmyong, and Redstar OS is designed to function within that walled garden. There is no access to Google, no YouTube, no Wikipedia, just state-approved content, delivered through state-approved channels, on state-approved hardware. Redstar OS isn't banned globally. It's simply never allowed to leave the system it was built to control. You can't buy it, you can't download it, and if you somehow manage to get a copy and install it on your own machine, you'd be using an operating system designed to spy on you in a country that has no use for it. The operating system exists entirely within North Korea's borders, and that's exactly how the regime wants it. Windows 7 and XP. When an operating system stops receiving security updates, many institutions ban it, not by law, but by policy. Windows XP was released in 2001. It became one of the most successful operating systems in history. Businesses ran it, governments ran it, hospitals, banks, schools, and military installations ran it. And then, in April 2014, Microsoft ended support. No more security patches. No more bug fixes. Any vulnerability discovered after that date would remain unpatched forever. For individual users, this was an inconvenience. For institutions handling sensitive data, it was a crisis. If you're a hospital storing patient records, or a bank processing transactions, or a government agency managing classified information, you cannot run software that is no longer secure. It doesn't matter how stable the operating system is. If it's not being patched, it's a liability. So governments around the world began issuing internal external bans. The United States federal government prohibited the use of Windows XP on federal systems. The British National Health Service was ordered to migrate away from it, although many hospitals failed to do so in time, which played a role in the devastating WannaCry ransomware attack in 2017. Germany, Japan, and Australia issued similar directives. Windows 7 followed the same path. Support ended in January 2020, and institutions that were still running it were given deadlines to upgrade or face compliance violations. This wasn't a legal ban in the traditional sense. You couldn't be arrested for using Windows 7. But if you were a government contractor, a healthcare provider, or a financial institution, and an audit found Windows 7 running on your network, you could lose certifications, face fines, or be removed from approved vendor lists. These are security compliance bans, and they're incredibly common. When an operating system reaches end of life, it doesn't disappear from the world, but it disappears from the environments that matter most. Linux distributions. Not every ban is public. Some operating systems disappear simply because organizations refuse to allow them. Linux is open source, flexible, and powerful, but that doesn't mean it's welcome everywhere. In corporate and government environments, IT departments maintain strict lists of approved software. If an operating system isn't on that list, it's effectively banned, even if there's no law against it. Why would an organization block Linux? Certification. Many industries require that the software running on their systems be certified by regulatory bodies. If a Linux distribution hasn't gone through that certification process, it can't be used, even if it's technically superior. Compliance issues also play a role. Some Linux distributions don't meet the specific security standards required by government contracts or financial institutions. Then there's support. Corporations want someone to call when things break. If a Linux distribution doesn't have enterprise-level support contracts, doesn't have guaranteed update cycles, or doesn't have a legal entity that can be held accountable, it won't be approved. These bans are invisible to the general public, but they shape adoption in powerful ways. A technically excellent operating system can be completely locked out of entire industries simply because it doesn't meet bureaucratic requirements. And once that happens, the operating system doesn't just lose market share, it loses legitimacy. It becomes something hobbyists use, not something serious organizations trust. Of course, not all operating systems disappear because they were blocked. Some just failed spectacularly on their own, which is exactly what we're covering in Every Failed Operating System.